Tonight on Free Minds TV, we'll be discussing a new study which indicates that pasteurized milk might not be as safe as we originally thought, plus a church that's being gone after for giving away free water, the Nobel Peace Prize, plus a whole lot more coming up tonight on Free Minds TV.
Welcome to Free Minds TV, where we challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. With you, as always, is Toby.
And Nick.
Well, Nick, we've got a few different stories to get into tonight. We've got that story about milk. We've been following the milk controversies throughout the United States for the past, 7 years or so. Raw milk and all the dangers of that. We have a story kind of the flip side of raw milk. Maybe it's that pasteurized big farm stuff that might be a little less safe. But before we get into that, I want to talk about a really scary bill that's coming out on the federal level. It's an anti-protest bill. And we've talked about this before. We've been covering the free speech zones and such for years now. Essentially, yes, you have the right to protest, but only where the government sanctions you to protest. You know, usually behind a corner where no one can see you, where the media won't see you, with a fence walling you off from everybody else. You know, don't protest where the government officials might be able to see you or where the media might be able to pick up on you. That's not where they want you to protest. It's in more of a secluded zone away from everybody else. That's not the true freedom of speech, but this is like free speech zones on steroids, it seems.
Yeah, well, it's being pushed forward with the idea of it being an anti-trespass bill. It's made it through the House. There were only 3 dissenting votes in the House as opposed to 388 in favor of this legislation. It passed the Senate unanimously, and now it's just waiting on a presidential signature. It's H.R. 347 is a piece of legislation, and it's not a good story. Basically, under the act, the government will be given the power to prosecute people who are trespassing on the White House grounds, which apparently has not been in the Federal Register yet. Currently, surprisingly to me, it's just been enforced with a local ordinance in Washington, D.C. But the bill goes a lot further than that, and it's the implications that go beyond that that are the most troubling. Under the act, the government is also given the power to bring charges against Americans engaged in political protests anywhere in the country. The new legislation allows prosecutors to charge anyone who enters a building without permission or with the intent to disrupt a government function with a federal offense, and this is a 10-year federal felony, by the way, if Secret Service is on the scene. But the law stretches to include not just the president's residence. Under the law, any building or grounds where the president is visiting, even temporarily, is covered, as is any buildings or grounds restricted in conjunction with an event designated as an event of national significance. Now, that distinction is made by the Department of Homeland Security, and they point out that it covers, in the past, it has covered everything from funerals for Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan to Super Bowl 36 to the Democratic and Republican national conventions. So if you're charged with attempting to disrupt the RNC or the DNC, you could be facing a 10-year federal prison sentence. And it's not just the president who has Secret Service protection, by the way. This goes for anybody who's protected by the Secret Service. They point out that just hours after the act passed, presidential candidate Rick Santorum was granted Secret Service protection. Mitt Romney has it as well. Oh yeah, and they also point out some other upcoming events for this year that will be national security events or special national security events would be the 2012 G8 and NATO summits, which will be held in the United States this year. So people potentially facing 10-year prison sentences if they protest. And we've already seen with recent Republican and Democratic national conventions, Toby, we've seen, and G8 and G20 meetings that have happened in the U.S. and other places, we've seen no hesitation on the part of police forces to crack down, arrest people. And unfortunately now, instead of just looking at a disorderly conduct charge, potentially you're looking at 10 years in federal prison.
And I doubt that this will be enforced to the point where everybody who's at the protest is going to be facing 10 years in prison. I think the majority of them will still face that disorderly conduct charge, but it's the ringleaders. Those people may be facing more stringent penalties. So.
Right, for essentially protesting. Here's what we're talking about.
Well, for organizing. I think that that's the direction this kind of legislation goes. It would look far too draconian to actually crack down and start throwing mass numbers of people in prison. I don't think that's what's going to happen at all. I think it's going to be selectively targeting certain individuals and threatening them and the ilk. So I guess what it says is, yes, you still have all the rights in the First Amendment to protest and all that good stuff, except in areas of significance.
Right, or
where
anywhere where a dignitary happens to be.
Where you'd want to
whether
protest.
you know it or not.
You can go protest in a field somewhere out in the middle of Utah or something. Do they have fields in Utah or just in deserts? But
very dry fields.
Very dry fields of sand. But go and do it where you actually want to do it, where you want to get officials' attention, media attention.
Well, and a lot of times that's in Washington, D.C., and I mean, it's hard. There are a lot of presidential candidates and people with Secret Service protection. Anywhere on the National Mall. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily know. I mean,
you disrupt the Super Bowl. That would really upset people. I guess actually that really would upset the public.
Probably, but yeah, I mean, this isn't just a bill that's, the title of it kind of tried to imply that it was a trespass bill, and that's not really
trespassing on public property where you have the right to protest, or used to have the right to
protest. Right. So I mean, it's unfortunate. It's scary, but that's what the legislation does, and there were only 3 dissenting votes. Ron Paul and Justin Amash were among them, and then there was one other representative, I believe, from Georgia, but it might have been Brune. I don't have his name in front of me.
Only 3 dissenting votes? Wow.
3 to 388. And I'll point out, for all the civil liberties voting Democrats out there, they were all Republicans.
Oh.
Not one Democrat actually voted against this.
But what about all the Tea Party small government folk?
That was them, the 3 people that
decided there was a mass of them. There were supposedly more small government folk in there.
Well, apparently with a vote like this, you get to see how it actually breaks down. And when it comes to civil liberties, in this case, you had 3, 2 of whom are libertarian-leaning Republicans, and not sure about the other one.
Nick,
no Democrats came over.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Most of the Republicans didn't come over. You had 3 people. Yeah. 3 kooks, really. I mean, these are people that
crazy.
They're probably not even well liked by their own party in the House, and these are the madmen voting against.
This isn't to say that the Republicans are the party of liberties.
They're certainly not. No, they're not. But I just
more than the Democrats.
I just wanted to point out how some people out there think that this is, this type of legislation. A few years ago, it was easy to blame it on the Bush administration or blame it on Republicans, but now we see that it's really a bipartisan problem when it comes to protecting civil liberties, with a very few exceptions out there.
Yeah, well, the fearless leader Barack Obama, for Hope and Change,
I'm surprised Dennis Kucinich didn't vote against this.
Maybe he wasn't there for the vote.
I was going to say it was only 300.
He would have voted against it. He's as crazy as Ron Paul.
Yeah, I imagine he probably would have voted.
And I say crazy in a good way.
If Mike Gravel was still in, then he'd probably vote against it, but he wasn't in. He hasn't been in for a while, so.
Yeah, well. What are you going to do?
There's 2 more. There were 2 Democrat kooks we were able to name that might have, but those are outliers. They really are. When you consider it's less than 1% of the House voted against this. Over 99% support. So it must be a good idea, right?
Sure. Well, you know what else is a good idea, Nick? Banning churches from giving away water.
Sounds like a good idea to me.
Yeah, I guess so. At least that's what Louisiana thinks. A Louisiana church was ordered to stop giving away free water along Mardi Gras parade routes because they did not have the proper permits. We were given a cease and desist order, said Matt Tipton, pastor of the Hope Church in Metairie, LA. We had no idea that we were breaking the law. Tipton said volunteers from his church were handing out free coffee. Ooh, not just water. It was also coffee. And free bottles of water at 2 locations along Mardi Gras parade routes when they were stopped by Jefferson Parish officials. The church volunteers were cited for failing to secure occupational licenses and failure to register for a sales tax. Why do they need to register for a sales tax if they're giving stuff away for free? Anyways, the church had purchased about 5,000 bottles of water labeled with the church's name and website on it. Hidden motives. We're just giving away water. They were advertising for themselves. They must be stopped. They gave the remaining bottles to the local drug rehab center, so I guess it wasn't all for a loss. Still got to give away their water. No word on the coffee. The pastor here said that they offered to provide volunteers to clean up trash or even help clean the portable toilets. However, city leaders did not initially respond to Tipton, and he said he was given the runaround. He was told to go through three different department heads in order to help out. Quote, the idea that you need an additional level of bureaucracy stopping a church from showing kindness to its members of the community is a perfect example of a waste of taxpayer money and resources. And I couldn't agree more. You know, when you're laying off teachers and throwing the mentally disturbed out onto the street so that they can confront law enforcement officials in a very bad way. When you're cutting government in that way, you still have the resources to cite churches for giving away free water. Oh, in all fairness, I should say that they were given a written warning, and they're not going to be fined unless they do it again. Cease and desist order, Nick. So, I guess wasn't too heavy-handed.
It is enough to shut them down
Yeah.
in terms of distributing water, which is something that people need. You can go a lot longer without food than you can with water.
It just makes you wonder, Nick. You've got this big bloated government, and how is it that I mean, it seems like all the areas that I see the need for, you know, teachers and school and sick and mentally ill and disabled individuals, those are all the areas getting the cuts. Meanwhile, there's tanks coming to Keene through federal grant money, and there's bureaucracies shutting down free water and coffee, as well as too much bureaucracy, too many department heads in order to let a church clean the portable toilets. Where do we go wrong, Nick?
Yeah, I don't know. It's, I think basically it's unfortunate, but I think that generally you see programs that are beneficial to big business or to vested interest groups that have a lot of lobbying power, whether those are people who work for government or whether they're people who benefit from government programs like large farms that benefit from farm subsidies. They've got lobbying power. They've got a voice. Typically when you're dealing with the homeless, the mentally ill, people who really can't function in society, basically anybody who doesn't have much money or much clout, you know, usually the weakest members of society, they don't have a whole lot of a lobby. So obviously their programs get cut first, but we know farm subsidies are still in place. Military spending is, they are cutting some programs, but frankly, we're not looking at real reductions in military spending anytime soon. Yeah, I think if you look across the board, wherever you've got lobbyists, wherever you've got powerful special interests that want to keep their programs intact, you're going to see very little progress made in actually cutting those programs. People who don't have much lobbying power, though, of course, their programs are kind of the first to go because they're really not that critical to winning elections or anything that politicians find useful.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, you mentioned federal subsidies for agriculture, and one of those, the people who make the most money off that, they're not the little farms. That's what people think of it when they're thinking about subsidies for agriculture. Well, it's to save mom and pop farms, right? That's what this money is for, all these billions of dollars. Well, most of it's actually going to the very, very large farms, the ones that you don't really think of as needing any help. They don't need help. In fact, a lot of the time they're paid to get rid of the grain, you know, if they're growing too much of it to keep prices the same, all sorts of yucky junk. Anyways, Nick's got a story about what some of the consequences, unintended consequences, are of having such very large farms where you pack a lot of cattle in. We talked about this last week.
And this is something that I think a lot of people would say, no, it's a market. Well, frankly, if you look at even just the crops that we do grow in the U.S., some of the most heavily subsidized crops are grain crops. Corn is a big one. Tobacco is still subsidized. A lot of foods that a lot of people now saying maybe we shouldn't be eating tons and tons of grain. Maybe we shouldn't be feeding tons and tons of grain to livestock animals. But grain's cheap to grow. It makes for cheap meat. And basically, the argument that I've heard made by a lot of people advocating a different diet or a more sustainable form of agriculture, because this enormous grain-based agriculture that we've got coming out of the Midwest really is not natural, it's not sustainable, and it's got other environmental consequences. But one of the arguments I've heard by a lot of people advocating a shift back to more sustainable, natural, human-scale agriculture is that the federal government has no interest in seeing that happen. They are interested in the cheap food policy, even if it's crap food. Let's see, the website Natural News is reporting that a new study out of Harvard University showing that pasteurized milk product from factory farms is linked to causing hormone-dependent cancers. And now the study focused on concentrated animal feeding operations, which are like these big feedlots where they feed them lots and lots of corn that was probably subsidized. Otherwise, it's not all that profitable to grow. And these factory farms turn out milk, which they then pasteurize. I don't have enough information from the study to really see whether the pasteurization process makes any difference at all. It just so happens that the milk that's coming out of these enormous factory-style milking operations is almost always pasteurized. But they found that pasteurized factory milk was found to contain up to 33 times more estrone sulfate, which is a growth hormone linked to testicular, ovarian, I'm sorry, they don't mention ovarian, testicular, prostate, and breast cancers, which are some pretty common cancers out there. And it's, it's similar to estrogen. It's xenoestrogenics, I think is a fancy term that natural food advocates use. Chemicals that are close to hormones in the human body that confuse your body and then can cause things like testicular cancer or breast cancer. So I think this is a clear case that what the government does to meddle with agriculture is not always helpful. Not always helpful to family farms, as you pointed out, Toby. I think if you actually look at the effect of farm subsidies, and the way they've been carried out, a lot of times that funding came with strings attached that ultimately ended up resulting in family farms going out of business as opposed to really helping them in the long run. And most of the dollars from farm subsidies are going to these enormous farms. These feedlots actually are getting the subsidies. Family farmers who might be carrying out agricultural practices that produce healthier food or fewer environmental consequences, they're not getting as much help. And they have to compete with subsidized products on the marketplace, these big farms that the federal government keeps in business, and they keep them in business in a way that they can compete on price in a way that family farms can't.
Yeah, meanwhile, we've been covering lots of stories about the federal government going after raw milk distributors or individual Amish farmers, distributors, shutting them down. They're introducing child labor bills on the federal level that are essentially going to be banning kids from working on farms. There are some kids can work on the direct family farms, like it's their father's farm or something, with lots of restrictions, like not being able to climb a ladder more than 6 feet high. They point out all the dangers of kids working on farms. Something they don't often point out on the federal level when they're concocting all these bills are some of the unintended consequences of their legislation. The unintended consequences of subsidies that looks like an increase in certain kinds of cancers. What about the unintended consequences of telling kids they can't work on the farm? What are they going to do instead? Sit on the couch and become fat little couch potatoes because they're not allowed to go out and work? Oh, or maybe much, much worse. What do you do in rural America where you have nothing to do? No job. Oftentimes turn to drugs like methamphetamine. I mean, it's the truth. That's where there's the biggest problems is rural America where there's nothing to do.
That's true.
So how about learning how to take risks? It's telling kids that
productive risks. I mean, smoking methamphetamine would be taking a risk.
I'm talking about the risks of like climbing ladders.
Right. Risks that that you need to take to do productive things.
I mean, there's all these unintended consequences by telling kids they're not allowed to work on the farm that they're not thinking about.
Or really do anything. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, we've got these bills in place saying that kids can't work on farms or they can't really work much until they're 18. And then I think generally as a societal attitude, Toby, we're now in a position, and in some senses it makes sense because it is a more complex world. People need more of an education. But with a lot of young people going to college now, Toby, there's not even an expectation that you really get a job at all. It's not considered odd to not have had a job until you're 22, 23 years old.
Well, I find it
odd. And I find that pretty odd, too.
And then we wonder why new employees don't have a work ethic.
Right. Right, and I think, yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly a place for higher education. There's also a place for real-world experience, and I think to say that one is so much more important than the other is just not accurate. I think that there's a need to balance book learning with real-world application if you want to have a productive citizenry and a productive workforce. And a lot of the efforts, particularly here we're dealing with what's taking place on family farms, Toby, but a lot of the efforts that have been taking place in the name of keeping kids safe, they really don't make a whole lot. It's not like we have kids picking coal anymore or crawling inside machinery. And a lot of the restrictions, the new restrictions that they put in place as far as child labor laws, basically just ensure that kids won't work very much or very hard until they're 18 at least. And quite often it means not until they're 22, 23 years old. Which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
No, not at all. I think that, I know I worked when I was younger, my whole life, growing up on a farm and then getting a job as soon as I could, and it was helpful. It gives you a work ethic. It gives you a sense of pride. It gives you a sense of responsibility. I think there's all sorts of different reasons for doing that, but I guess not. It's kind of like you got to have safe playgrounds, right? Safe playgrounds with no dangerous monkey bars or big old metal slides that you can go and have fun on. No, that might cause scrapes or, God forbid, even some broken bones here and there. So you got to have rubberized everything and plastic everything that actually studies have shown aren't very good for kids. Yes, it'll keep them scrape-free in the short term, but in the long term they miss out on the ability to take risks and learn their own limits and all that other healthy stuff that kids need to learn. It wasn't too long ago that humans didn't grow up in this protective bubble of society, and I think that it's still important to remember that risk-taking is an important part of development. Hopefully not too dangerous, but learning your limits.
Yeah, it's there are negative, as you were pointing out, there are negative consequences to not allowing that to take place, because otherwise they find out when they're much older and taking much more significant risks like driving or making other decisions that are much more likely to result in death or serious injury. And unfortunately, I think that to an extent has happened, where people don't understand risk as well.
And the way history gets fuddled and smudged, who knows what the actual history is, but there's all this stuff of child labor laws were put into place to protect the children, right? Because all the children were getting eaten by the machinery.
Well, there were cases. There were certainly cases.
But that's not why the legislation went through. It went through because adults wanted jobs and the kids were taking them.
Actually, that is one reason why the labor movement pushed for it.
That's the big reason. It wasn't for the sake of the kids.
Kids were undercutting.
Kids were still very expendable at that time. That's why compulsory education came through, is because, well, they wanted to take kids out of the workforce so that adults could go to work.
Otherwise, you'll undercut the labor prices, and all of a sudden, the unions can't argue for higher wages. So that certainly was part of it, yeah.
A big part, but that's not really taught in the regular.
No, that doesn't get covered anymore.
No, it's because we care about
That's
kids.
not to say we should have children crawling into machinery or
not.
working in coal mines.
But this is just how the writers of history fudged the numbers.
Yeah, well,
the government's...
History is one of those things that's very subjective, Toby,
yes,
and there are a lot of different ways to look at it.
Yes, and there were child advocates out there saying, no, we shouldn't this is for the kids too. But the big pushers following the money train were more of the labor unions and such.
Right.
The reason the legislation actually went through. All right, let's move along here, Nick. Let's talk about the Nobel Peace Prize. The one that Barack Obama won back in 2009.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like Bradley Manning has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize this year. Well, I think that's interesting. That's why I'm going to say something about it. It doesn't mean too much. Lots of people are nominated, as the AP points out here in this story. But I thought I would mention it, if not just to stir up his name a little bit and talk about him a little bit. Manning is most famous for allegedly leaking troves of classified documents, including State Department cables and military files, to WikiLeaks. He was arraigned last week at Fort Meade in Maryland and is being charged with engineering the biggest leak of classified information in U.S. history. Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, who allegedly received the leaked information from Manning, was nominated last year, although he did not receive the prize. Manning is now going to be right alongside Bill Clinton and Bill Gates and other international figures who have been nominated for this year's award. But, as I mentioned right in the beginning, this does not actually mean you're a man of peace whatsoever. Obama won it back in 2009, and we all know that he's killed lots of people. Not personally, but, his policies.
Yeah, he hasn't really ended it. I mean, I don't see anything that he's done that merits a Nobel Peace Prize at all. Beyond the fact that he's continued wars, it's not like he ended a great deal of them. I mean, the drawdown in Iraq was about it, and that was kind of already planned by the Bush administration. So, and he's saying no options are really off the table with Iran. So what exactly he's done to promote global peace, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and what's Bill
He hasn't
Clinton
invaded another country out and out. I mean, there was the Libya intervention. There was some bombing, but there wasn't actually a whole invasion.
Wait, why is that? That's something that I've wondered since I was a little kid. I remember listening to the radio about how at first in the Gulf War we were just bombing them and everyone was hoping that there's no ground invasion. Why is it that dropping bombs that blow people up from way up high in the sky is seen as more peaceful than going down and shooting them in person?
Well, it's not more peaceful. It's just less it's less messy, really, for you.
It's
not for them.
It seems much worse to me. It's peacefully sitting in your home and I'd actually rather someone come and fight me.
Yeah, well, I mean, that would be good. Might be better. You'd rather that, but the person who has to come and fight you wouldn't prefer it.
But it's always seen as...
I mean, it really depends on what side you're on, right? I mean, if you're the country getting bombed from the air, it doesn't seem very peaceful. If you're the country that doesn't have to send any troops in, and,
But even if it's a kid,
you can just pretend it's the weather or something, like the bombs just drop from the clouds.
Well, even as a kid, I remember being told, well, there's no ground war yet, so it's okay. How is it okay? They're dropping bombs from the sky.
Yeah, I mean, there've been a lot of air campaigns. I still remember Kosovo. I mean, I still remember the air campaign there.
I just don't get it. Why is it that you hear it all the time, like, it's not a ground invasion. Oh, phew. It's just a bombing invasion.
Well, I mean, I can't say that the intervention in Libya was on the same scale as the full-on invasion of Iraq or
I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying the mindset.
Afghanistan.
And it's nothing unique to Obama. It's unique to, I think, the way that the media has portrayed such events and the government officials have portrayed them. It's not a real issue unless you have ground troops invading. Yeah. I think that bombs are
relatively, we've had so many invasions lately that, the air campaigns, you just have to kind of brush aside.
What kills a larger number of people at once, Nick? A bomb or a gun?
Well, the air campaigns do kill a lot of people, and that's actually where a lot of the collateral damage comes from. Not necessarily troops on the ground, but the air campaigns.
Oh, well. Maybe I'm just a crazy person for thinking so. Probably. You have different thoughts? FreeMindsTV.com is the website where you can tune in for the archives of the show and to contact us and all that good stuff. Next week, I'm sure we'll be back with more craziness. Until then, it's been Toby here with you. Have a good one.